so you all could do this to me, your mother, after all I did for you people.
Delphine Carter stood alone in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a piece of paper that would change everything she believed about the people she loved most. It was a real estate flyer. Her house. Her address. Her photograph, taken without her knowledge, printed beside a price and a phone number that wasn't hers. She read it 3 times before her hands began to shake, because nowhere in that stack of mail had anyone asked her permission. She had raised 4 children within those walls. She had buried her first husband from the porch swing where he used to read the newspaper every Sunday morning. And now, at 68 years old, with her mind as sharp as it had been at 40, the people she trusted most were quietly making plans to sell everything she had built, while she still had every ability to stop them, if only someone had told her the truth. Before we go further into what Delphine discovered that day, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Delphine found next confirmed her worst fear. Tucked beneath the flyer was a second document, one she had never signed, never seen, and never agreed to. It bore the letterhead of a nearby facility called Sunset Bluff Assisted Living, and printed clearly across the top was a move-in date less than 6 weeks away. There was no diagnosis attached to that folder. No doctor's note. No conversation that had ever taken place between her and the people who claimed to love her. Just a date, a price, and a plan that had clearly been in motion for far longer than she had been allowed to know. She sat down at the kitchen table where she had once helped 4 children with their homework, and for the first time in years, she felt like a stranger inside her own home. To understand how a woman like Delphine ended up here, you have to go back nearly 4 decades, to a young woman just starting her career in a school district that would come to define her life. She had taken her first job as a classroom aide at 23, a year after marrying Wallace, a quiet, steady man who worked construction and talked more with his hands than his mouth. They bought the lot on Magnolia Street with almost nothing, and Wallace built the frame of their first house himself over 2 summers, working nights and weekends while Delphine carried their firstborn, Renee, on her hip and mixed mortar when he needed an extra set of hands. By the time their 4th child, Michael, was born, the house had grown twice, a sunroom added the year Trevor arrived, a second story raised the summer before Angela came into their lives as Wallace's niece, taken in after her own parents proved unable to care for her. Wallace and Delphine's marriage was never showy, but it ran deep in the way marriages built through shared labor often do. They fought about money in the early years, the way most young couples with growing families do, and they made up over coffee at the kitchen table long before either of them learned to raise their voices about anything larger. Wallace was not a man who spoke often of his feelings, but he showed them in the additions he built onto their home each time their family grew, in the way he never once complained about the noise of 4 children under one roof, in the small, steady rituals he kept, like reading the paper on the porch swing every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee going cold beside him because he was too busy listening to whichever child had climbed up next to him with a story to tell. Delphine often said, later in life, that she had learned more about patience from watching Wallace raise their children than from any book or training course in her long career. Her career grew alongside her family in those same years. She moved from classroom aide to full teacher, then to assistant principal, and eventually to district administrator, a role she held for over 2 decades before retiring. She was known throughout the district as the woman who remembered every student's name, every parent's face, every small crisis that came through her office door, and she carried that same instinct for detail into her own home. She ran her household the way she ran her office, with warmth but also with structure, with an open door but also with expectations. Her children grew up understanding that their mother noticed things, that very little slipped past her, and that lesson would matter more than any of them could have predicted decades later, when it became the very thing that saved her. Wallace passed on a Sunday morning in early autumn, his heart failing quietly while he sat on the porch swing he had built with his own hands, the newspaper still folded on his lap. Delphine grieved in the way she did everything else, fully and without apology, taking the time she needed and then rebuilding her life with the same steady discipline that had carried her through everything before. She kept working for 3 more years before retiring, kept the house exactly as it was, kept Sunday mornings sacred even after the porch swing grew quiet. It was nearly 8 years after Wallace's death that she met Marcus at a community fundraiser, a retired insurance adjuster with an easy laugh and a habit of remembering her coffee order before she had finished giving it, and for the first time since her husband's passing, she allowed herself to imagine a second chapter. Looking back, Delphine could trace the earliest seeds of what happened to conversations that felt, at the time, like nothing more than the ordinary give and take of two people building a life together later in life. Marcus courted her patiently, learning the names of her children before he ever met them, asking thoughtful questions about Wallace without ever seeming threatened by the memory. In their second year of marriage, he began gently steering their finances toward joint management, suggesting it would simplify things as they got older, a suggestion that seemed reasonable enough that Delphine agreed without much hesitation, transferring a portion of her retirement savings into an account they shared. He handled the paperwork himself, explaining the details in a way that always left her feeling informed without ever quite leaving her holding the documents long enough to read every line closely, a pattern so subtle she never once registered it as a pattern at all. He was, by every appearance, an attentive husband, remembering anniversaries, planning small trips, listening carefully when she spoke about Wallace or her children in ways that made her feel truly heard rather than merely tolerated. It was the same attentiveness, she would later realize, that made him so effective at learning exactly which levers mattered most to each person in her family, which insecurities sat closest to the surface, which old wounds had never fully closed. He asked Renee detailed questions about her divorce during their early years together, questions that seemed like genuine concern at the time. He drew Trevor into long conversations about the family business more than once, always framed as simple curiosity about Wallace's legacy. What Delphine could not have known then was that he was quietly building a map of her family long before he ever had any specific plan for how to use it. Her 4 children had reacted differently to Marcus from the very beginning, and those early differences, invisible at the time, would later become the very fault lines Marcus learned to work along. Renee, exhausted from raising 2 kids largely on her own after a difficult divorce, welcomed Marcus almost immediately, relieved her mother would not be alone. Trevor kept his distance from the start, still nursing an old wound from years earlier when their late father's small contracting business had been sold rather than passed down to him, a decision Delphine had made for practical reasons that Trevor never fully accepted. Angela grew close to Marcus in a way that surprised everyone, including herself, a closeness that deepened once it was discovered, years into his relationship with Delphine, that Marcus was in fact her biological uncle on her father's side, giving her a blood connection to the family in a household where she had always quietly felt one small step removed from the others. Michael, the youngest, had moved 3 states away for a job in his mid-20s and stayed connected mostly through holiday calls, trusting that whatever needed handling at home was being managed by whichever sibling stood closest to it. For years, none of this seemed to matter. The family gathered for holidays, celebrated birthdays, and functioned the way most families do, imperfectly but genuinely, with old resentments simmering quietly beneath a surface that mostly held. It was roughly 2 years before the flyer appeared that the first small shifts began, though none of them registered as anything more than ordinary family friction at the time. Marcus started mentioning, almost in passing, that he had begun looking into long-term financial planning, framing it as responsible foresight for 2 people entering their late 60s. He asked Delphine gentle, seemingly caring questions about how she would want things handled if her health ever declined, questions that felt, at the time, like the kind of thoughtful conversation any loving partner might raise. She answered honestly, told him she wanted to stay in her home as long as she possibly could, told him the house meant more to her than any of them fully understood. Marcus nodded, said he understood completely, and let the conversation drop. Around the same time, small comments began surfacing at family dinners, comments that felt like jokes in the moment but carried a different weight in hindsight. Trevor mentioned once that his mother had forgotten his daughter's birthday, though she had not, having simply sent the card a few days late due to a scheduling mix-up that any reasonable person would forget within the hour. Renee, exhausted from her own life, laughed along without really questioning the claim, and the comment settled into the family's collective memory as though it were established fact rather than a minor exaggeration. Delphine noticed these small moments but did not dwell on them, because questioning the people you love is not something that comes naturally, even when something quietly feels off. The locked drawer appeared roughly 8 months before the flyer, tucked into the study Wallace had once used as his home office, a drawer that had never been locked in all the years Delphine had lived in that house. She noticed it while looking for old tax documents, tried the handle out of habit, and found it would not budge. She mentioned it to Marcus in passing, and he explained smoothly that he had started keeping some of his own private paperwork there, insurance documents from his previous career, nothing that concerned her. She accepted the explanation without pressing further, unaware that this particular detail would later become one of the first threads she pulled when everything began to unravel. The call that changed everything came 3 days after the flyer, and Delphine only overheard it because she had forgotten her reading glasses in the den and turned back to retrieve them. Renee's voice drifted through the half-open door, low and rushed, the way people speak when they do not want to be overheard. She was on the phone with someone from a realty office, confirming a walkthrough date, using her mother's full legal name as though she had every right to authorize it. Delphine stood frozen in the hallway, listening to her own daughter describe the house room by room, details only someone intimately familiar with the property would know to mention, spoken with the ease of someone finalizing a transaction rather than discussing a plan still meant to be a secret. She did not confront Renee that day. Something in her, some old instinct built over 3 decades of managing a school full of students who lied to her constantly, told her to wait, to watch, to gather more before she said a single word. That instinct led her, 2 days later, to Marcus's car, parked in the garage while he napped upstairs after his usual Sunday routine. She told herself she was only retrieving an umbrella from the back seat. But there, tucked into a folder wedged beneath the passenger seat, was everything laid out in black and white, evidence that confirmed every uneasy feeling she had been quietly suppressing for months without ever fully naming it to herself. The folder contained an appraisal report dated weeks before that family dinner where they had first floated the idea of her downsizing, a conversation she had dismissed at the time as idle speculation rather than an already moving plan. Beside it sat a spreadsheet with 4 names on it, her 4 children, each assigned a percentage of a number that made her sit down right there in the driver's seat, the leather cool against her back as she read figures that represented 4 decades of her life reduced to a column of projected profit. Beside each child's name, Marcus had left small handwritten notes, reminders to himself about who needed convincing and who did not. Renee's note referenced her mortgage troubles, a private financial struggle Delphine had not even known her daughter was facing. Trevor's note referenced his lingering resentment over the family business. Angela's note simply read already on board. Michael said call him last, easiest to convince from a distance. She read the spreadsheet twice, then a third time, searching for some explanation that would make this look like anything other than what it plainly was. She found none. She placed the folder back exactly as she had found it and walked into the house as though nothing had happened, though something in her had shifted permanently in the span of those few minutes alone in the garage. That night, once the house had gone quiet and Marcus had retired upstairs, she called her longtime attorney, a woman named Corinne who had handled her affairs since Wallace's passing, and asked for a meeting first thing in the morning, telling no one in the house where she was going or why. Corinne's office confirmed, within the first 20 minutes of their meeting, what Delphine had already suspected but had not wanted to accept as fact. A power of attorney document had been filed with a local bank 3 months earlier, bearing a signature that was close to Delphine's but not quite right. Corinne pulled bank records next, cross-referencing account activity going back nearly 6 months, and together they found a pattern of withdrawals, small at first, then gradually larger, funneled into an account Delphine had never seen or authorized in her life. Corinne explained gently that what Delphine was describing had become disturbingly common, a spouse quietly repositioning an aging person's assets under the assumption that formal consent would arrive eventually, or would not be strictly necessary once enough paperwork had been signed by someone. Corinne's investigation moved methodically once Delphine gave her the go-ahead to pursue every available avenue. The handwriting analysis took nearly 3 weeks to complete, conducted by a forensic document examiner Corinne had worked with on previous cases, a meticulous process that involved comparing the signature on the power of attorney against more than a dozen authentic samples of Delphine's handwriting pulled from old tax returns, greeting cards, and school district paperwork spanning decades. The examiner's final report identified inconsistencies in letter formation, stroke pressure, and spacing that were nearly invisible to an untrained eye but stood out clearly under magnification, concluding with a high degree of confidence that the signature had not been produced by Delphine herself. The bank forensics proved equally revealing, tracing a pattern of transfers that had begun small, a few $100s moved here and there under vague descriptions, before growing steadily larger over a 6-month period. Corinne's financial investigator mapped each transaction against a timeline of family events, noting how withdrawals tended to follow closely after conversations Marcus had documented in his own notes, evidence suggesting a deliberate, almost experimental pattern of testing how much could move without drawing attention before escalating further. Corinne presented all of it to Delphine in a single afternoon meeting, laying the timeline out like a case file, and it was in that meeting, more than any other, that Delphine finally understood the full scope of how long and how carefully this had been building beneath her own roof. For a while, Delphine believed Trevor was behind it. He had the motive, the resentment, the years of feeling overlooked. She watched him more closely over the following days, noted his short temper at dinner, his refusal to make eye contact when Sunset Bluff came up in conversation. During this same period, her suspicion briefly landed on someone outside the family entirely, a longtime neighbor named Patricia who had lived 2 houses down since before any of Delphine's children were born, a retired realtor who had grown close to Marcus over shared conversations about local property values. Delphine invited her over for coffee under the guise of neighborly conversation, steering things toward real estate without revealing what she had already found. What she learned complicated her assumptions rather than confirming them. Patricia had answered a few general questions for Marcus months earlier, believing them to be ordinary curiosity, and had no idea any appraisal or facility paperwork existed at all. Patricia had not been a co-conspirator. She had simply been another unwitting piece Marcus had used without her knowledge, gathering fragments from multiple sources so that no single person held enough of the picture to raise an alarm. A conversation with Angela, meant to be reassuring, revealed far more than either of them intended. Angela mentioned, almost proudly, how patient Marcus had been explaining everything to her over the past several months, how he had told her that Renee and Trevor were the ones pushing hardest for the sale, how he had specifically asked her not to bring the subject up with her mother until they had a solid plan already in place. Delphine listened carefully, thanked Angela for the coffee, and left with a colder understanding of exactly whose hands had been steering this from the very beginning. She spoke at length with a financial advisor who specialized in elder asset protection, a soft-spoken man named Harold, who told her plainly that what had happened to her followed a pattern he had seen more often than most people wanted to believe. He walked her through the mechanics of how these situations typically unfolded, explaining it rarely began with a single dramatic decision and almost always began with a slow accumulation of small permissions, a signature obtained for one stated purpose and applied elsewhere, a pattern of concern voiced just often enough to normalize the idea of decline before any real decline had occurred. She also began quietly researching Sunset Bluff itself, discovering that no formal application had ever been submitted through any legitimate channel, no medical evaluation had ever been requested by any doctor she had seen, and the file associated with her name had been opened based entirely on paperwork the facility had accepted without independently verifying her actual capacity or consent. By the time Delphine called the family dinner, she was not walking into a confrontation she had not planned. She was the one who had built it, calmly, over the course of nearly a month, while everyone around her assumed she still knew nothing at all. She invited Michael to fly in for the occasion, telling him only that she wanted the whole family together. She waited until dessert had been served before she placed a single folder on the table. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked Renee to explain the phone call with the realtor. She asked Trevor why his name appeared on a spreadsheet he claimed to know nothing about. She watched Angela's expression change most dramatically of all, as she began to realize the story Marcus had told her privately was not the same story he had told anyone else at that table. What unraveled that evening was not a single conspiracy but 3 or 4 separate ones, each built on a different lie Marcus had told a different person. He had told Renee that her mother's memory was declining faster than anyone else was willing to admit. He had told Trevor that this arrangement represented his long-overdue chance to finally receive something he had always felt owed. He had told Angela that Renee and Trevor were the ones pushing hardest for the sale, positioning himself as the reluctant peacemaker. And Michael had been fed the softest, vaguest version of all, a story about their mother wanting a simpler life. Renee broke down first at the table. Trevor, red-faced and visibly shaking, turned his anger toward Marcus with a fury that surprised everyone, including himself. Angela sat in stunned silence, staring at the spreadsheet, at the 3 words beside her own name. Michael asked the question no one else had thought to ask aloud, wanting to know precisely how long this had been happening, and Delphine answered with dates pulled directly from the folder in front of her, dates stretching back nearly 8 months. Delphine let the silence sit for a long moment before she spoke again, calmer than anyone at the table expected. She told them she had already revoked the fraudulent power of attorney the week before. She told them the Sunset Bluff paperwork had never been valid to begin with. She told Marcus, without raising her voice, that she had also filed for divorce 11 days earlier, quietly, before she had ever found the folder in his car, for reasons that had little to do with money and everything to do with a marriage that had been growing distant long before any of this began. The house, she told them, was never going to Sunset Bluff. It was never going to be sold at all. Marcus attempted, briefly, to reframe everything at the table, insisting his intentions had always been protective. But the specificity of the evidence left little room for the kind of explanation that might have satisfied anyone still listening. The legal proceedings that followed took considerably longer to resolve than the emotional reckoning at that dinner table. Corinne referred Delphine to a colleague who specialized in financial exploitation cases involving older adults, a careful attorney named Denise, who explained early on that cases like this rarely moved quickly. The deposition took place nearly 4 months after that dinner. Delphine answered every question plainly, describing the forged signature, the withdrawals, the appraisal, the spreadsheet, without embellishment. Marcus's attorney attempted several times to suggest that ambiguous conversations about the future had been misread as full consent, but the independent handwriting analysis left little room for that argument to gain any real traction. Renee and Trevor were both called to testify as well. Renee's testimony focused on the phone call with the realtor, walking the court through exactly what Marcus had told her about her mother's supposed decline, details that sounded even more clearly manufactured once spoken aloud in a formal setting. Trevor's testimony centered on the spreadsheet and the private conversations Marcus had had with him about the family business. Both siblings later told Delphine that speaking the truth in that room, however uncomfortable, had helped them let go of a guilt neither had been able to fully shake on their own. The case ultimately resolved through a combination of civil restitution and a formal finding of financial exploitation, resulting in Marcus being ordered to repay the funds already withdrawn and permanently barred from any future financial authority over Delphine's affairs. In the weeks and months that followed, Delphine did not cut her children off, though she would have had every right to. She restructured her estate into an irrevocable trust with Corinne's guidance, protecting the house from ever being touched again without a legitimate, thoroughly documented medical need verified by professionals with no financial stake in the outcome. Renee's healing took the longest, carrying a particular guilt that her siblings did not share quite as heavily, spending much of the following year in counseling working through her own long-standing fear of becoming a burden to her own children someday, a fear Marcus had exploited by making her mother's supposed decline feel like a preview of her own future. By the following spring, she and Delphine had rebuilt something close to their old closeness. Trevor's anger toward Marcus seemed to burn away years of quieter resentment he had carried toward his mother, and several weeks after the legal proceedings began, he and Delphine finally had the honest conversation about the sale of Wallace's business that neither of them had ever properly had. By the following winter, Trevor had begun driving up most Sundays, rebuilding the porch swing tradition his father had started decades earlier. Angela's year was the most complicated of all 4 children, caught between her loyalty to Delphine and the strange, unresolved reality that Marcus remained her only living connection to her father's side of the family. Those conversations never fully satisfied her, but they helped her eventually let go of the guilt she carried, and her relationship with Delphine deepened by the end of that year, built now on a hard-won honesty that had not existed between them before. Michael made a point of calling his mother far more regularly than he had in years, no longer content to rely on second-hand summaries filtered through whichever sibling happened to reach him first. By the following holiday season, all 4 of Delphine's children sat around her table together for the first time in over a year, joined by Renee's kids and Trevor's daughter, the porch swing creaking gently in the background exactly as it had for nearly 4 decades, a small, ordinary sound that had nearly been silenced forever by a plan none of them had seen coming until it was almost too late. What stayed with Delphine longest, long after the legal matters had settled, was not the anger, though there had been plenty of that in the early weeks. It was the quieter realization that this had never really been about the house at all. It was about which of the people around her had still seen her as a woman fully capable of making her own decisions, and which of them, even briefly, had already begun treating her as something to be managed rather than someone to be consulted. She often wondered how many other women her age were sitting in kitchens just like hers, holding paperwork they had never signed, trusting people who had already, without ever announcing it, stopped seeing them as anything more than an asset waiting to be divided. If you were watching closely enough, would you have caught the small signs before she did, or would you have trusted the people closest to you the same way she once did? Before we move on to the next story, tell us in the comments what would you have done differently if you were in Delphine's position, and how early do you think you would have noticed something was wrong? If this story affected you the way it has affected so many others who have shared their own experiences with us, make sure you're subscribed, because there are more stories just like this one waiting for you, and we would genuinely love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight.